Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku shattered one for all's limit. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air was a toxic cocktail of pulverized asphalt, ozone, and fear. Every ragged breath Izuku Midoriya dragged into his lungs felt like swallowing glass shards. The symphony of battle was a chaotic masterpiece of destruction. The percussive boom of Bakugo's explosions, the sharp, crystalline crackle of Todoroki's ice, and the deep, guttural roars of the monster they were failing to kill. It was a Heian Nomu, but it was unlike any they had encountered before. This one was sleek, almost elegant in its midnight black anatomy, with exposed musculature that pulsed with a faint, shimmering light. It possessed a terrifying intelligence that shone in its multiple, unnervingly calm eyes. Dr. Garaki had outdone himself. This creature, which the heroes had codenamed Newton, was a living refutation of the laws of physics. Its quirk, as they had disastrously discovered, was kinetic reversal. It didn't nullify attacks, it consumed them. Every punch, every explosion, every concussive blast was absorbed into its form, causing the shimmering aura around it to glow brighter, hotter. It was a battery being charged by their own desperation. DKU. Left flank. Bakugo's voice was a serrated edge, cutting through the din. It's focused on ICY hot. Hit it now! Izuku didn't need the command. One for all coursed through him at a stable 45%, a familiar green lightning crackling around his limbs. He was the anchor of their formation, his mind racing faster than his body, calculating trajectories, analyzing weaknesses, trying to find a seam in the Noma's absolute defense. He propelled himself off a shattered wall, using Black Whip to create a pivot point in midair. Manchester Smash! He roared, bringing his leg down in a powerful axe kick aimed at the Noma's head. The monster didn't even flinch. It simply tilted its head, allowing the full force of the blow to connect with its shoulder. The impact should have shattered bone, or at the very least sent it staggering. Instead, there was a dull, sickening thump, and the shimmering field around the Noma flared with a brilliant emerald light, mirroring the color of his own power. The kinetic force of his kick vanished, devoured whole. The Noma's head swiveled, its four crimson eyes locking onto him. It felt like being pinned by lasers. A flicker of something akin to amusement crossed its grotesque features before it moved. It wasn't a blur of speed, it was an instantaneous relocation. One moment it was 20 feet away, the next its massive, clawed hand was swiping at the space he had just occupied. Izuku twisted in the air, another whip of black energy lashing out to pull him clear. The claws missed by a breath, but the wind pressure alone felt like a physical blow, tearing at his costume. It's getting faster, Todoroki called out, his voice strained. He stood atop a massive glacier of his own creation, sweat beading on the left side of his face while frost clung to the right. Every hit we land adds to its physical capabilities, then we hit it harder until it overloads. Bakugo retorted, unleashing a furious volley of AP shots. The focused, armor-piercing blast struck the Noma's chest, each one causing its internal light to pulse like a malevolent heartbeat. Kaken, no! Izuku yelled, landing hard on the buckled asphalt. You're just making it stronger. We have to find another way. Shut up. There's no power in the damn universe that doesn't have a limit. Bakugo rocketed forward, his palms glowing with incandescent heat. Howitzer impact. The resulting explosion was colossal, a swirling vortex of heat and light that engulfed the Noma completely. For a breathtaking second, the street was bathed in blinding orange. But as the smoke cleared, the Noma stood untouched, its shimmering aura now burning with the intensity of a small sun. It had absorbed all of it. Impossible, Todoroki breathed, his composure finally cracking. The Noma flexed its claws, and the ground around it erupted as it released a fraction of the stored energy, Bakugo's own power, in a directed shockwave. The blast sent Bakugo tumbling through the air like a ragdoll, slamming him into the side of a building with enough force to crater the brickwork. He slumped to the ground, smoke rising from his gauntlets, momentarily out of the fight. The situation was deteriorating at an alarming rate. Their mission had been simple: assist in the evacuation of the Kashigawa commercial district after reports of a high-level villain attack. The pros had engaged first, and one by one, they had been taken down, their powerful attacks serving only to fuel the monster. Now, it was just Class 1A's forward combat team, and they were learning the same fatal lesson. Everyone, focus on defense and evacuation. Ida's voice boomed, his armored form a blur of motion as he darted between panicked civilians and the spreading chaos. Our primary duty is to the citizens. He was right. Uraraka was already in action, tapping collapsing chunks of a nearby overpass, making them float harmlessly before guiding them away from a small group of people huddled in a storefront. "I've got the debris!" she shouted, her face pale with straying. Ida, the bus on the corner, a city bus, its driver slumped over the wheel, was teetering on the edge of a fissure created by the Noma. Inside, a dozen terrified faces were pressed against the glass. Ida didn't hesitate. Recipro turbo. His engines flared, blue flames erupting as he accelerated to his maximum velocity. He became a living projectile, slamming his shoulder into the rear of the bus with a tremendous metallic shriek. He pushed, legs pumping, the sheer force shredding the armor plating around his calves and searing his uniform. With a final, agonizing heave, he shoved the bus clear of the fissure just as the road beneath it crumbled away into the sewers below. He collapsed to one knee, his engine sputtering, his legs trembling violently. It was in that moment of heroic distraction that the Noma chose to act. It ignored Todoroki's fresh wave of ice and Izuku's black whip tendrils. It saw the bigger prize. With another of its instantaneous shifts, it appeared directly above the storefront where Uraraka was focused on a precarious billboard. "Uravity!" Izuku screamed, his blood turning to ice. She looked up, her eyes widening in terror. She had no time to react. The Noma's arm pistoned down, not even aiming for her, but for the billboard she was holding suspended with her quirk. The blow struck the metal sign with the force of a meteor. The physics were cruel. The Noma's attack overloaded the sign's structural integrity, but Uraraka's quirk was still active. Instead of being pulverized, the massive sign, now free of the building's support, acted like a giant whip. Its far end, still weightless, swung around and struck her with brutal force, a sickening crunch echoing even over the sounds of battle. She was thrown against the storefront's reinforced window, which spiderwebbed on impact. She slid to the ground, a crimson stain spreading across her side, and didn't move. "Uraraka!" Ida's cry was one of pure anguish. He forced himself to his feet, engines reigniting with sheer willpower, and sprinted towards her. Something inside Izuku snapped. The careful calculations, the strategic mindset, the controlled 45%, it all evaporated in a searing wave of white-hot rage. The faces of his friends, broken and bleeding because he wasn't strong enough, flashed before his eyes. All Might's trusting smile. The weight of the sacred torch he carried. It was all for nothing if he couldn't protect them right now. "You!" he growled, the sound barely human. Green lightning exploded from his body, no longer a gentle crackle but a raging storm. The asphalt around his feet fractured and splintered. "Izuku, no! Don't be reckless!" It was Nana Shimura's voice, a desperate whisper from within the core of One for All. He ignored her. He let the power flood his limbs, the familiar, agonizing sensation of his bones groaning under the strain of 100%. The pain was a distant echo, drowned out by the roaring in his ears. The Noma turned, its multiple eyes fixing on the new, overwhelming power signature. It seemed to grin. A horrifying, stitched-together mockery of a smile spread across its face. It opened its arms, an invitation. "Feed me. I'll give you more than you can handle," Izuku roared. He launched himself forward, a green comet of righteous fury. The distance between them closed in less than a heartbeat. Detroit. Smash! His fist connected with the Noma's chest. This was not a 45% kick. This was the full, unadulterated power of One for All, the culmination of 8 generations of strength, focused into a single, cataclysmic point. The shockwave was biblical. The very air compressed and detonated. Windows for 3 blocks in every direction simultaneously shattered into dust. The ground behind the Noma was ripped apart, forming a deep trench that stretched for 100 meters. It was the single most powerful punch Izuku had ever thrown, and it did nothing. The moment of impact was surreal. The Noma's body absorbed the blow with a deep, resonant whump. Its shimmering aura, once a bright glow, now blazed with the terrifying brilliance of a supernova. It didn't even slide back an inch. It had taken his 100% smash, the kind of blow that could change the weather, and had simply eaten it. Izuku's arms screamed in protest, fractures spiderwebbing up his ulna and radius. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the cold, absolute dread that washed over him. He had given it his ultimate weapon, and it had only made the monster stronger. Bakugo's words echoed in his head with bitter irony. There's no power in the damn universe that doesn't have a limit. He had just found one that seemingly didn't. And he had just handed it the warhead. The Noma's light was so intense it was painful to look at. The air around it warped and sizzled with heat. It slowly raised its right hand, and the stolen energy, the sum total of every attack from every hero, began to coalesce into a sphere of pure, incandescent kinetic force above its palm. Izuku's danger sense, which had been a constant, high-pitched scream for the last 10 minutes, suddenly changed. It was no longer a warning. It was a lament. It was the universe telling him that the time for prevention had passed, and the time for consequences was here. He could feel the sheer density of the energy in that sphere. It wasn't just a big explosion waiting to happen. It was a city killer. It would not just level the block, it would atomize it, leaving a crater where thousands of lives had once been. He saw it all in a horrifying, slow-motion panorama. He saw Todoroki, exhausted, trying to form a desperate wall of ice that would be as effective as tissue paper. He saw Bakugo, struggling to his feet, his eyes wide with a rare, genuine fear. He saw Ida, shielding Uraraka's unconscious form with his own broken body. He saw the faces in the bus, the civilians in the shops. He was the 9th user of One for All, the successor to All Might. And he was about to preside over a massacre. Failure. The word was a brand on his soul. It's too much. Yoichi Shigaraki's voice was faint, a thread of despair from the ancient past. It's become a singularity of stolen power. There's no output that can match it. Output. The word snagged in Izuku's mind, a single piece of driftwood in a tsunami of panic. Output. He had been thinking about it all wrong. All his training, all his focus, had been on controlling the output. How to shape it, how to release it, how to manage the percentage, pushing power out of himself and at a target. But One for All wasn't just a well of power he could draw from. All Might had described it as a sacred torch, passed from one to the next. The vestiges lived inside it. It was a world unto itself. An internal universe of stockpiled energy. He had been trying to drain a swimming pool with a bucket, but the Noma wasn't going to be beaten by a bigger bucket. It would just absorb that too. Yoichi was right. There was no output that could stop it. So what if he stopped trying to push? What if instead he pulled? It was an insane thought, born of absolute, final-second desperation. It defied every rule, every bit of training, every instinct for self-preservation he had. His body was a vessel, and a leaky, fragile one at that. It could barely handle the pressure of 100% being forced out. To try and pull the entirety of the quirk's infinite reservoir in, to make himself the focal point of all that power at once, it wasn't just suicide. It was self-deconstruction. Don't. Nana's voice was a shriek of raw panic in his soul. You'll be torn apart. The quirk will break. But he saw Ida's determined face. He saw Uraraka's blood on the pavement. He saw the Noma's sphere of death pulsing, ready to detonate. I don't have a choice. He closed his eyes. He let go of the pain in his arm. He let go of the fear. He let go of the concept of percentage. He reached inward, past the roaring river of 100%, past the deep pool of accumulated strength. He reached deeper, into the very heart of the quirk, to the nexus where the 8 ghost flames of the previous users burned. He reached for the core, and he didn't just pull. He threw open the floodgates, and willed the entire ocean to crash down on him. For one eternal, terrifying moment, he felt it. He felt the entirety of One for All. Not as power, but as experience. He felt Yoichi's defiance in a cage of darkness. He felt the second user's desperate flight. The third's grim battles in a world of shadow. He felt the weight of Heike Shinomori's lonely 4 decades of isolated stewardship. He felt Daigoro Banjo's final, defiant roar. And suffocating end, Nana Shimura's heartbreaking sacrifice, the image of her young son's face flashing behind her eyes. He felt All Might's 30 years as the symbol of peace, the joy, the pain, the terrible burden of his smile. He felt it all, every second of every life, every hope, every despair, all compressed into a single, unbearable point of consciousness inside his own soul. The vestiges didn't just whisper. They didn't just scream. They converged into a singular, psychic supernova of pure, undiluted agony and terror within him. It was the sound of a universe being born and dying in the same instant, and then silence. Externally, the effect was even more profound. The first thing that happened was the absence of sound. Not quiet. An absolute, metaphysical void of noise that sucked the air from everyone's lungs. The roar of Bakugo's struggling explosions, the crackle of Todoroki's ice, the hum of the city, the very wind, it all ceased to exist. The second thing was the absence of color. The world bled into a stark, grayscale photograph. The brilliant orange of Bakugo's gauntlets, the vivid red and white of Todoroki's hair, the deep blue of Ida's armor, all of it was reduced to shades of ash. The only color that remained was Izuku Midoriya. A torrent of pure, incandescent, green-white energy did not erupt from him. That would have been a simple explosion. This was something far more terrifying. The energy rewrote the space around him. The air itself seemed to thin, to warp, as if reality was a fabric being stretched to its breaking point. The light didn't radiate, it simply was, a column of impossible power connecting Izuku to the sky. The Nomu, its sphere of annihilation poised to launch, froze. Its intelligent eyes, for the first time, showed not amusement or confidence, but stark, primal terror. It was a creature that consumed energy, and it was now facing the source code of energy itself. It tried to absorb the power leaking from Izuku. But there was nothing to absorb. The energy wasn't kinetic. It wasn't thermal. It wasn't any form of energy that obeyed the laws of its quirk. It was something more fundamental. The Hien Nomu, the pinnacle of Garaki's genius, the monster that had consumed a 100% Detroit smash without flinching, began to come apart. It wasn't violent. It was quiet. Eerie. Its left arm, the one holding the sphere of power, began to glitch like a corrupted video file. It flickered in and out of existence before dissolving into a fine, black dust that simply ceased to be. The sphere of kinetic energy it had collected didn't detonate. It didn't fizzle out. It was just gone, deleted from the equation of reality. The Nomu opened its mouth in a silent scream as the effect spread. Its torso, its legs, its head, all of it began to unravel. Its very atoms were being pulled apart, its physical form unwritten from the world. It was not killed. It was not destroyed. It was unmade. Within 3 seconds there was nothing left but a faint stain of shadow on the ground, which then faded into the gray asphalt. The silent, colorless world held for another heartbeat. Then, with a sound like a single, colossal church bell ringing from 1,000 miles away, reality snapped back. Color flooded the scene. The sounds of the city, the distant sirens, the wind whistling through the canyons of shattered buildings. It all rushed back in a disorienting wave. Where the Noma had stood, there was nothing. The only evidence of the confrontation was the ground. The asphalt and concrete in a 15-foot radius around where Izuku stood had been transmuted. It was no longer pavement. It had become a smooth, crystalline, emerald-like substance that reflected the afternoon sun with an unnatural gleam. It looked like a scar of green glass torn into the fabric of the city. In the center of this impossible crater stood Izuku Midoriya. The pillar of light was gone. The overwhelming presence had vanished. He was just a boy again, standing in a torn and bloody hero costume. His right arm was a mangled ruin of purple and black, his 100% punch having taken its toll. But that was not the most horrifying injury. Across his entire body intricate, branching patterns of scars glowed with a faint, residual green light. They spread from his chest, up his neck, across his face, and down his arms and legs, like lightning had been frozen just beneath his skin. Lichtenberg figures, the mark left by a massive, uncontrolled electrical discharge. The mark of the shattering. From his position against the wall, Bakugo stared, his mouth slightly agape. He hadn't seen a punch. He had seen an event. A phenomenon. It was a power so absolute, so far beyond the simple metrics of strength and speed, that it broke his entire competitive worldview. He had always been chasing Deku, believing that with enough effort, enough rage, enough power, he could catch and surpass him. But what he had just witnessed wasn't on that path. It wasn't the next step. It was a different path entirely, one that led somewhere he couldn't even comprehend. Todoroki, standing on his melting glacier, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with his ice. He had grown up in the shadow of Endeavor's overwhelming power. He knew what it felt like to be in the presence of a force that could erase you without a thought. What he had just felt from Midoriya was 100 times more potent. It wasn't the heat of a fire. It was the silent, crushing gravity of a black hole. Shota Aizawa, having just arrived on the scene with other pros, skidded to a halt, his capture weapon half unfurled. His logical, analytical mind, the mind that could break down any quirk, any combat situation into its component parts, was drawing a complete and utter blank. He had seen the flicker of monochrome, had felt the instantaneous silence. He had seen the Nomu, a threat that had neutralized a dozen pros, simply cease to be. And in the center of it all was his student, his problem child. Izuku stood for a long, silent moment. His head was bowed, his green hair shadowing his face. Then, his body began to tremble. A shudder racked his frame, a violent, uncontrollable spasm. Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes, normally so full of life, emotion, and heroic fire, were wide open, and they were completely, terrifyingly white. Blank orbs staring at nothing. He took one shaky step forward, and then, like a puppet with its strings cut, his body gave out. He collapsed, his fall unnervingly silent. He crumpled onto the edge of the emerald crystallized ground he had created. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. The silence that followed Izuku's collapse was a fragile, crystalline thing, quickly shattered by the cacophony of reality rushing back in. The first sound was Shota Aizawa's voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the stunned stillness of the other heroes arriving on the scene. "Medic team, now! Secure a perimeter! Everyone else, back!" Paramedics swarmed the area, their professionalism a stark contrast to the sheer impossibility of the scene. They stopped short at the edge of the emerald crystallized ground, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion. What is this stuff?" one of them murmured, kneeling to inspect the strange, glass-like substance. "Don't touch it!" Aizawa barked, his eyes fixed on the still form of his student. "Focus on Midoriya." Two medics cautiously approached, their boots crunching on the normal asphalt just beside the bizarre crater. They began running diagnostics, their voices tight with controlled urgency. "No discernible pulse. Wait, no, there it is. Tachycardic at 220, dropping, now bradycardic at 35. This is impossible, the monitor must be malfunctioning. Body temperature is 40 degrees Celsius and climbing. Pupils are fixed and dilated. Severe trauma to the right arm, multiple compound fractures. But these marks," the medic gently brushed a gloved finger near one of the glowing green Lichtenberg scars on Izuku's neck. He flinched back with a yelp. "Static discharge. A strong one." Aizawa's blood ran cold. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. There was only one person to call for a situation this far outside the realm of understanding. His thumb hovered over Nizu's contact. "He's not just injured," Aizawa said, his voice low and grim, both to the paramedics and to himself. "He's a radiological hazard. Get him on a reinforced transport. We're not going to Central Hospital's main wing. Route us to sublevel Gamma. Full quarantine protocols." The head paramedic looked at him, bewildered. "Sir, sublevel Gamma is for uncontained quirk events. For villains." Aizawa's gaze didn't waver. It was a hard, black glare that promised dire consequences for any argument. "He is an uncontained quirk event. Go." The sterile white of UA's Special Threats Medical Ward was blinding. Sublevel Gamma was a place whispered about among staff, a state-of-the-art facility designed by Niza for the worst-case scenarios, quirk awakenings that dissolved reality, biological quirks that became plagues, energy emitters who went critical. It had never been used for a student. Izuku Midoriya lay on a reinforced medical bed in the center of the primary observation suite. An array of sensors, scanners, and monitors surrounded him, their wires snaking back to a bank of computers in the adjacent control room. He was intubated, not because he couldn't breathe, but because his respiratory rate was fluctuating so erratically the machines couldn't decide if he was hyperventilating or dying. In the room with him was the diminutive form of Recovery Girl, her usual grandmotherly warmth replaced by a grim, professional focus. She held her hand over Izuku's chest, her eyes closed in concentration, but she wasn't activating her quirk. She was merely listening. In the observation room on the other side of a thick, radiation-shielded plasteel window, 3 figures stood in somber silence. Nizu, the principal, sat perched on a custom-built high chair, his paws steepled before his snout, his intelligent black eyes reflecting the chaotic data streams on the monitors. Beside him, Shota Aizawa stood with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of stoicism. And then there was Toshinori Yagi. The skeletal form of the former number 1 hero seemed more fragile and hollow than ever. He leaned heavily against the cool glass, one hand pressed to the pane, as if he could somehow reach through it and anchor the boy who had inherited his legacy. His breath misted the window. The guilt radiating from him was a palpable force, a suffocating shroud that filled their small, silent space. "Chio, any change?" Niza asked, his voice soft, breaking the long silence. Through the intercom, Recovery Girl's voice crackled, weary and strained. "None. His condition is... I don't have a word for it. It's not stable, but it's not degrading. It's in a state of constant, violent flux." She sighed, a sound heavy with a century of medical experience hitting a wall. "I tried to heal the arm. Just a small application of my quirk." She shook her head. "It was like trying to patch a boat in the middle of a hurricane. The moment I injected stamina and accelerated his cellular regeneration, this energy flared up. It repelled my quirk. I felt a jolt, like a powerful electric shock. Worse, it seemed to feed on the energy I was giving him. The fractures in his arm actually got worse for a split second before settling back to their current state." Toshinori flinched as if he'd been struck. "So you can't heal him?" His voice was a ragged whisper. "I can't," she confirmed, her tone leaving no room for argument. "My quirk works by amplifying a body's natural ability to heal itself. It requires a stable biological system as a baseline. Izuku's body is not a stable system right now. His cellular structure is vibrating, resonating with a frequency I've never encountered. His bioelectric field is a chaotic storm. Trying to heal him with my quirk is like trying to douse a grease fire with gasoline. It only adds fuel to the chaos." She gestured to the main monitor, where a 3D rendering of Izuku's body was overlaid with incomprehensible data. "Look at this. His mitochondrial energy output is 1,000 times that of a normal human, but his cells aren't burning out. They're being constantly rewritten. His neural activity is equivalent to someone experiencing every possible sensory input at once. He should be dead. By every metric of medical science, his body should have torn itself apart from the sheer stress. But it hasn't." She looked back at Izuku's still form, at the faint, sickly green glow of the scars beneath his skin. "He's not just a patient, Niza. He's a walking, unconscious reactor meltdown, held in a state of impossible equilibrium. He has become a faulty container for a power that has exceeded its design specifications." Aizawa finally spoke, his voice a low gravel. "The Nomu. It was unmade. I saw the footage from the street cams. There was no explosion, no force. It just dissolved. What did he do, All Might?" All eyes turned to Toshinori. He pulled his hand from the glass, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. He looked at his own skeletal hands. "I have used one for all at 100% thousands of times. I have leveled city blocks. I have changed the weather. But every smash, every single one, had a will behind it. A purpose. It was my strength, focused and directed. It felt human." He looked through the window at his successor. "What I saw, what I felt from young Midoriya in that moment, it was not human. It was cold. Absolute. It felt like a fundamental law of physics being enacted. There was no rage in it, no triumphant cry. It was the power of a god, but with none of the consciousness. It wasn't a stronger smash. It was something else. Tashinori walked over to the wall of the observation deck, the one facing the direction of the battle site miles away. He placed his palm flat against the cool metal. "I can still feel it," he whispered, his eyes wide. A faint hum. A resonance in the air, in the very bedrock of the building. Whatever he did, it wasn't a momentary burst. He rang a bell that has shaken the entire world, and the echo is still ringing. Nise's whiskers twitched. He hopped down from his chair and trotted over to a large terminal, his claws clicking on the polished floor. He brought up satellite imagery, thermal readings, and energy signature scans of the Kashigawa district. "He is correct," Nise stated, his tone a chilling blend of academic fascination and profound dread. "We're detecting a low-level, exotic energy emission from the site. It's centered on the crater he created. The material, this emerald glass, appears to be a stable but highly energetic transmutation of common silicate and carbon-based materials. He didn't just break the Nomu. He broke physics in his immediate vicinity." The principal turned to face the two heroes, his small frame casting a long shadow in the dimly lit room. "All for One always theorized about the quirk singularity, the point at which quirks would become too powerful and complex to be controlled. We all believed it was a generational threat, something for the distant future. It seems we were wrong." He gestured towards the boy in the bed. "I believe young Midoriya, in his desperation, did not just draw on his power. He forced it to a state of critical mass. He didn't just use one for all. He became a gateway to its conceptual core. A living, breathing singularity event." Aizawa absorbed this, his expression hardening. "So, the question is not just how we treat him. It's what he has become. Is he still Izuku Midoriya? Or is he just a shell for this thing?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. In the medical suite, one of the monitors hooked up to the hospital's main power grid began to flicker erratically, its screen buzzing in time with the faint, rhythmic glow of the scars on Izuku Midoriya's sleeping face. In a sterile, quiet waiting room 2 floors above, the mood was a thick tar of anxiety. Most of Class 1A was there, those who had been on the scene and those who had heard the news and rushed over. They were a scattered, miserable-looking group. Some were still in the tattered remains of their hero costumes, others had changed into simple hospital-issued sweats. Ida sat stiffly in a chair, his left leg encased in a heavy cast. The armor on his other leg was scorched and dented. His face, usually a mask of stoic order, was etched with guilt. He stared at his hands, replaying the moment the Nomu had appeared over Uraraka's head, the moment he had been too far, too slow. A few chairs away, Achiko Uraraka lay on a gurney, an IV drip in her arm. She was conscious, her head bandaged and a thick dressing taped to her side where the billboard had struck her. Her ribs were fractured and she had a severe concussion, but she was stable. She had woken up an hour ago, and her first slurred word had been, "Deku?" No one had known how to answer her. Shoto Todoroki stood by the window, looking out over the UA campus as dusk painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. He was outwardly the calmest of them all, but his mind was a turbulent sea. He had been raised by power. He had been forged in the crucible of Endeavor's ambition, a father who saw strength as the only virtue. He knew the feel of overwhelming force, the suffocating presence of a man who could incinerate you with a glare. What he had felt from Midoriya was different. Endeavor's fire was hot, loud, and full of rage. It was a personal, emotional power. The energy that had poured out of Midoriya was silent, cold, and utterly indifferent. It hadn't felt like an emotion, but a mathematical certainty. An absolute truth. It was the kind of power that didn't burn you. It simply decided you no longer existed. It reminded him of the stories his mother used to tell him about the cold, empty void between stars. For the first time since he had reconciled with his father, he felt that old, familiar, childhood terror of power too great to be defied. Across the room, Katsuki Bakugo sat alone, leaning his chair back against the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His gauntlets lay on the floor beside him, dented and scuffed. He hadn't said a word in over an hour. His usual explosive anger was gone, replaced by a brooding, unnerving silence that made everyone else give him a wide berth. Eijiro Kirishima, ever the brave one, finally decided to breach the perimeter. He walked over, his expression a mask of concern. "Hey, Bakugo, you okay, man?" "You were closest to him when it happened." Bakugo didn't look at him. His crimson eyes were fixed on a spot on the far wall, but they weren't really seeing it. "I'm fine," he bit out, the words clipped and devoid of their usual heat. "It was crazy, right?" Kirishima pressed, trying to find some common ground. "I've never seen Deku do anything like that. He just erased it. So manly but scary." Bakugo's hands tightened on his arms. "Shut up," he growled, the sound low and dangerous. "I'm just saying," I said, "shut up." Bakugo finally turned his head, and Kirishima flinched. The look in his eyes wasn't anger. It was something far more disturbing. It was a deep, profound confusion, mixed with a healthy dose of fear. "You didn't see it, shitty hair. You saw the light. You saw the thing disappear. You didn't see it." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "There was nothing there. No power. No punch. For a second, the world just stopped. And he was in the middle of it. He wasn't fighting it. He was it." Bakugo pushed himself off the wall and began pacing, his movements agitated, like a caged wolf. "All this time," he muttered to himself, his voice raw. "All this damn time. I've been trying to get stronger, faster, more power, to get to the top. I thought he was on the same mountain, just a few steps ahead. But he's not. He's not even on the same goddamn planet." He slammed his fist into the wall, leaving a small crack in the plaster. It wasn't an explosion. It was a contained, frustrated thump. The sound of a worldview shattering. "What the hell are you supposed to do?" he snarled at the floor. "When your rival stops playing the same game?" The waiting room door opened, and Aizawa stepped in. The chatter immediately died. Every eye snapped to him, desperate for news. "Uraraka Ida," he began, his voice flat. "Your parents have been contacted. You're both cleared for release once they arrive. The rest of you, your parents are being briefed. A bus will be here in 30 minutes to take you back to the dorms. There's a mandatory curfew and a gag order on the events of today. You will not speak of this to anyone. Am I clear?" Asiyev mumbled. "Yes, sensei," S answered him. It was Yaoyorozu who asked the question on everyone's mind. "Sensei, how is Midoriya-san?" Aizawa's gaze swept over the worried faces of his students. For a fleeting moment, the hard-edged pro-hero vanished, and all that was left was a tired, deeply concerned teacher. "Midoriya's condition is complicated," he said, choosing his words with deliberate care. "He is receiving the best possible care. But he is not responsive. But he'll be okay, right?" Uraraka asked, pushing herself up on her elbows, her voice trembling. "Recovery girl can fix him. She can always fix him." Aizawa's silence was more damning than any answer. He looked at the hopeful, terrified face of the girl who had been so grievously injured, and his own resolve wavered. He couldn't tell them the truth. He couldn't tell them that their friend, their classmate, their heroic anchor, might now be the single most dangerous object on the planet. He couldn't tell them that Recovery Girl's quirk was useless, or that the top minds in the country were looking at him not as a person, but as a problem in quantum mechanics. "We're doing everything we can," he said, the words feeling like a lie in his own mouth. "Now get ready to leave." He turned and walked out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in his wake. The small spark of hope that had been flickering in the room was extinguished, replaced by a cold, encroaching dread. They were just kids thrown into a world of gods and monsters. And it seemed their friend had just become both. Down in sublevel Gamma, Toshinori Yagi sat alone in the observation room, long after Nizu and Aizawa had left to manage the cascading political and logistical fallout. He was staring at the boy in the bed, his mind a maelstrom of guilt and memory. He remembered giving the boy the strand of his hair on that beach. He remembered the desperate hope in Izuku's eyes, the unshakable belief that he, a quirkless nobody, could become a hero. Toshinori had seen himself in that boy. He had chosen him not for his power, but for his heart. And what had that heart gotten him? It had pushed him to break himself, time and time again. And now, it had pushed him to break the very power that was meant to be his salvation. "You broke the dam," he thought, echoing Nana's internal warning he could almost feel as a faint memory within the embers of one for all left in him. "You broke the whole damn thing." He had passed on a torch. He had never imagined his successor would try to swallow the sun. As he watched, a nurse was making her rounds in the chamber, checking the readouts on a portable data pad. She was a brave woman, volunteering for a patient that made Geiger counters whine. She moved with practiced efficiency, her face calm. She noted the fluctuating vitals, adjusted and drip, and then moved to check the probes on Izuku's temple. As her hand passed over his forehead, not even touching him, the data pad in her other hand flickered and died, a wisp of smoke rising from its charging port. "Huh!" she murmured, tapping the dark screen. "Power surge, I guess." She looked down at Izuku. The faint green glow of the scars on his face seemed to pulse, just for a second, a little more brightly. It was almost imperceptible, a trick of the light, but Tashinori saw it, and a new, colder fear began to settle in his soul. The problem wasn't just the immense power locked inside Izuku. It was starting to leak. Consciousness did not return to Izuku Midoriya like a gentle sunrise. It came like a tidal wave of shattered glass, a cacophony of raw, unfiltered information that crashed against the shores of his mind. There were no dreams in the abyss he'd inhabited, only the deep, resonant thrum of the thing he had become. He was a bell that had been struck, and the ringing had not yet faded. The first sense to claw its way back was hearing, but it was not the hearing he knew. He did not hear sounds, he perceived their energy. The low, incessant hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights was not a sound but a thick, syrupy river of buzzing gold flowing through the ceiling. The quiet, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of his bag was a series of cool, blue pebbles dropping into the vast ocean of his awareness. He could feel the slow, gurgling journey of water through pipes in the walls, a deep, subterranean song. He could sense the faint, frantic whisper of electrons racing through the circuitry of the monitors beside his bed, a chaotic symphony of miniature lightning storms. The world was loud. Unbearably, deafeningly loud. He tried to retreat, to sink back into the quiet darkness, but the tide of sensation was relentless. It forced his eyelids open. Light. It was a physical assault. The sterile, white light of the room was not merely bright. It was a roaring waterfall of photons, a torrent of pure energy that hammered against his retinas. The colors were violent, hyper-saturated. The pristine white of the sheets was a blinding blizzard. The pale green of the wall tiles was a screaming emerald forest. He could see the dust motes dancing in the air, not as tiny specks, but as individual, shimmering galaxies, each one a universe of detail he was forced to process. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the afterimage was burned onto the inside of his eyelids, a searing map of the room's energy signatures. A groan escaped his lips, the sound of it a jagged, rough thing in the symphony of noise. He tried to move, to ground himself in the familiar territory of his own body. It was a mistake. His sense of touch had been corrupted, too. The thin hospital blanket felt like it was woven from sandpaper and static electricity. He could feel the individual threads pressing into his skin. He could feel the subtle warp and weft of the fabric. He could feel the charge built up in the synthetic fibers, a low-level crackle against his hyper-aware nerves. His body felt both profoundly numb and excruciatingly sensitive. The dull, throbbing ache of his shattered right arm was a distant continent of pain, but he could also feel the faint pressure of the air currents in the room shifting against the skin of his face. It was too much. Every sensation was a data point, every data point was a shout, and his brain, his poor, human brain, was being flooded. And beneath it all, inside him, the storm raged. One for All was no longer a warm, empowering glow, a reservoir of strength he could call upon. It was a churning, pressurized ocean of raw power sealed within the cracking vessel of his body. He could feel it sloshing against the cage of his ribs, a tempest seeking any fissure, any weakness, to escape. It wasn't a source of power anymore. It was a source of immense, terrifying pressure. He felt like a deep-sea submersible whose hull was groaning under the weight of the Marianas Trench, threatening to implode at any second. He could feel the individual quirks, twisted and warped by the storm. Blackwhip was no longer a set of useful, controllable tendrils. It was a nest of angry, lashing serpents made of solidified shadow and lightning, writhing in the core of his being. Danger sense, once a helpful premonition, was now a constant, high-frequency scream at the base of his skull, an unending alarm that had no target but himself. Float was a nauseating pocket of anti-gravity that made him feel perpetually unmoored, as if he might drift away into nothingness. Panic, cold and sharp, began to cut through the sensory overload. He needed to get up. He needed help. He needed all might. With a monumental effort of will, he forced his muscles to obey. He pushed himself up, his left arm trembling under the strain. He sat up in the bed, the world tilting violently. The roaring in his everything intensified. The simple act of sitting up felt like he'd been thrown into a centrifuge. The movement must have triggered an alert, because a moment later, the door to his room slid open with a soft hiss that sounded to him like a guillotine falling. A nurse stepped inside. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, her name tag reading Aoki. She held a datapad in one hand. "Midoriya-kun? You're awake!" Her voice was soft, meant to be soothing, but to Izuku, it was another wave of complex energy crashing into him. He could perceive the vibrations of her vocal cords, the warmth of her breath, the sincerity in the electrical signals of her brain that generated the thought. It was intimate and invasive. He tried to respond, to force his old self, the polite, earnest Deku, to the surface. "Aoki-san," he rasped, his own voice a foreign, grating sound. Her smile widened. "It's so good to see your eyes open. You gave us all quite a scare. How are you feeling?" How was he feeling? He felt like a ghost haunting a nuclear reactor. He felt like his soul was being shredded into a million pieces by a hurricane of light and sound. "A little fuzzy," he managed to lie, the word a pathetic understatement. "That's to be expected," she said, her tone professional and comforting. She stepped closer to the bed, her attention on the frantic monitors. "Your vitals are all over the place. Let me just check your—" She reached a hand toward his forehead to check his temperature. It was a simple, caring gesture. An act of healing. An act of humanity. And Izuku's panicked, overloaded instincts reacted to it as a threat. He didn't want to be touched. He couldn't bear another layer of sensory input. He had to stop her. He flinched back, his left hand coming up in a gesture that was meant to be a placating "No, I'm okay," but was born of pure, reflexive panic. He wasn't trying to use his quirk. He wasn't thinking about power. He was just a terrified boy trying to create a little space. But he was not just a boy anymore. A small, uncontrolled pulse of power, a single drop from the raging ocean within him, found a crack in the dam. It leaped from his trembling fingertips. It wasn't a smash. It wasn't even a flicker of green lightning. It was a nearly invisible shimmer in the air, a sharp, distinct snap like a dry twig breaking. A pinprick of pure, conceptual energy, raw and undirected. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The bank of medical monitors behind Nurse Aoki went dark in a cascading wave, each screen flashing a rainbow of dead pixels before going utterly black. A puff of acrid smoke plumed from the central ECG machine as its internal circuitry was flash-fried. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently and then died, plunging the room into the dim, gray light of the emergency fixtures. The 4-drip stand, made of metal, let out a low hum and then vibrated so intensely that the bag shook from its hook and fell to the floor with a soft splat. Nurse Aoki froze, her hands still outstretched. She let out a small, sharp gasp, not of fear, but of surprise. She looked from Izuku's horrified face to her own hand. "My arm!" she whispered, confusion coloring her voice. She tried to wiggle her fingers, but they didn't respond. She clutched her right arm with her left, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "I can't feel my arm. It's completely numb." Izuku stared. He stared at the dead monitors, their screens like vacant eyes. He stared at the wisp of smoke, a ghostly accusation in the dim light. He stared at Nurse Aoki's face, at the fear dawning in her kind eyes. He stared at her hand, clutching an arm that he had deadened. He hadn't punched her. He hadn't attacked her. He had simply gestured. He had tried to be polite, and he had hurt her. He had hurt a kind woman who was only trying to help him. The horror that washed over him was a cold, black tide, far more powerful than the sensory overload. It was a single, pure, crystalline note of self-loathing that cut through all the other noise. The faces of his injured friends from the battle flashed in his mind, Uraraka's bleeding form, Ida's broken body shielding her. He had failed to protect them, and now, he was a danger to the people trying to save him. Monster. The word was a venomous whisper in his own head. You're a monster. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing, unbearable force. His mind, already strained to the breaking point, simply buckled. It could not process the reality of what he had become. It could not bear the truth that his very existence was a threat. And so, it retreated. The world dissolved. The dim hospital room, the scent of antiseptic and burned electronics, the look of fear on Nurse Aoki's face, it all smeared and warped. It felt like being dragged backward, underwater, into an abyss. The sounds of the hospital, the alarms that had just begun to blare in the hallway, were replaced by a deafening, internal roar. The roar of the storm. He was no longer in the hospital. He was falling through a churning, chaotic vortex of emerald and white energy. It was the space inside One for All. The vestige realm. But it was not the calm, ethereal meeting place he had visited before. The circle of spectral chairs was gone, shattered into phantom splinters that swirled in the tempest. The very fabric of this mental world was torn and frayed. He saw fragments of memory fly past like debris in a hurricane, All Might's fist connecting with All for One, Nana Shimura's smiling face, a terrified man with white hair locked in a dark vault. He tumbled through the chaos, directionless, weightless. He called out, but his voice was swallowed by the gale, and then he saw them. The vestiges. They were not the composed, ghostly figures he remembered. They were corrupted data, struggling to maintain their forms against the violent energies of the storm he had created. Daigoro Banjo, the fifth user, was a lashing, unstable mass of black-whipped tendrils, a humanoid shape made of pure, angry motion, and the sixth was a shifting, suffocating cloud of dark smoke, his form constantly dissipating and reforming. Haikyud Shinomori, the fourth, was a pale, flickering apparition, so transparent Izuku could see the raging storm right through him. They were all there, all six of them, flickering like dying flames in a gale, their silent screams of effort visible in the contortions of their fragmented forms. But two figures were different. They were clearer, more solid, though even they seemed to shimmer under the strain. They stood on a small, stable island of calm in the heart of the vortex. Nana Shimura, the seventh user, her dark hair floating as if underwater, looked at him with an expression of profound sorrow and fear. Her form was steady, anchored by her powerful connection to Tashinori, and through him, to Izuku. Beside her stood a slender man with white hair and kind, tired eyes. Yoichi Shigaraki. The first. The origin. He was the anchor of this entire reality. And while the storm raged around him, he himself was preternaturally calm, the eye of the hurricane. He looked at Izuku not with anger, but with a deep, analytical pity, like a scientist observing a catastrophic experiment he had long predicted. So, Yoichi's voice was not a sound, but a thought projected directly into Izuku's mind, cutting through the roar. The vessel awakens. Izuku's own spectral form coalesced before them, trembling. He looked at his phantom hands, then back at the tormented figures of the other vestiges. What? What did I do? He asked, his thought voice a ragged plea. I hurt someone. I didn't even try to. What's happening to me? Nana Shimura drifted closer, her expression pained. Kid, we tried to warn you. When you fought that Nomu, you didn't just use the power, you reached into the core. Yoichi finished, his tone level and grave. For 9 generations, we have treated One for All like a reservoir. We drew water from the surface, careful not to disturb the depths. All Might was the master of this, drawing more than anyone before him, but always from the sustainable output. It was the entire philosophy of the quirk, to channel, to release, to output. He gestured to the swirling chaos around them. You were faced with a problem that no amount of output could solve. So, in your desperation, you did the one thing you were never, ever supposed to do. You stopped trying to draw from the reservoir. You tried to pull the entire ocean into yourself at once. Yoichi's projection walked to the edge of their calm island, looking out into the emerald tempest. Imagine One for All as a dam, holding back an ocean of near-infinite energy. Every smash is a controlled release through the spillway. What you didn't just open the spillway wider. You put a fundamental crack in the foundation of the dam itself. Izuku stared, the metaphor sinking in with sickening clarity. The power! It's leaking? Leaking is too gentle a word, Nana said, her voice trembling with the memory. When you did that, Izuku, we all felt it. It was an uncreation. A pulling apart of the very structure of the quirk. The vessel of One for All, the metaphysical container that has held this power for over a century, was shattered. What's left is a fractured shell, barely holding together. Izuku's mind flashed back to the nurse, to the dead electronics, to her numb arm. So that pulse, it wasn't me attacking. It was the power seeping through a crack. Precisely, Yoichi confirmed. You are no longer in full control, because the systems of control are broken. The power is no longer flowing through the designated channels we have spent generations reinforcing. It is bleeding into reality through the fractures you created in the vessel. Your body, your mind, you have become the fault line. The full weight of it crashed down on Izuku. The sensory overload, the internal pressure, the constant screaming of danger sense. It was the feeling of a broken container trying to hold an infinite substance. His body wasn't just a host for a quirk. It was the crumbling wall of a prison holding a cosmic horror. Can I fix it? Izuku pleaded, his voice cracking. Can I repair the dam? Yoichi turned to him, and for the first time, a flicker of something truly ancient and weary crossed his face. Repair it? Boy, you don't even understand what it is you've broken. You still think of One for All as a simple quirk, a stockpile of physical strength. He raised a hand, and the storm around them seemed to quiet for a moment. In the vortex, Izuku could see not just memories, but swirling galaxies, nebulae of green and white light, the birth and death of silent, internal stars. This power, the one my brother forced upon me, it is more than a quirk. It is a seed of a universe. Every bit of life force, every ounce of will, every hope and dream of every user has been stockpiled, not just added. It has compounded. It has reached a density that transcends normal physics. One for All is not just a quirk in a world of quirks. It is a self-contained reality of stockpiled energy. Yoichi looked him dead in the eye, his gaze piercing the core of Izuku's soul. You didn't just break a quirk, Izuku Midoriya. You have cracked open the door to a universe. And now, it is bleeding into yours. The revelation was too vast, too terrifying to fully comprehend. A universe. An infinite wellspring of creation energy, and he had broken the faucet. He was the leak. He was the disaster. The storm in the vestige realm, mirroring his own internal shock and horror, began to rage anew, stronger than before. The fragmented forms of the other vestiges cried out as they were battered by the fresh gale. Nana and Yoichi's forms began to flicker. The strain is too much, Nana cried out. He can't maintain this. He can't handle the truth of it yet. He has to. Yoichi insisted, but even his form was starting to destabilize. He is the only one who can. The island of calm shattered. The full force of the storm slammed into Izuku, and his consciousness was violently ejected, flung out of the depths of his own soul. He gasped, his eyes flying open. He was back in his body, back in the hospital bed. The world rushed in again, the noise, the light, the pressure. But this time, it was different. This time, he understood it. He could feel the crack in the dam. He could feel the infinite ocean of One for All pressing against it, seeking to pour through. The room was filled with people. Doctors, nurses, and in the doorway, a grim-faced Aizawa, his capture weapon half unfurled. Nurse Aoki was sitting on a chair, another medic examining her arm. All eyes were on him. Fearful eyes. Aizawa took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching a wild, unpredictable animal. Midoriya, he said, his voice low and steady, a rock in the storm of Izuku's senses. Don't move, just breathe. Izuku wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain. But what could he say? Sorry, I accidentally broke a universe and now it's leaking out of me? He looked down at his own hands, trembling in his lap. The faint, green Lichtenberg scars beneath his skin seemed to pulse in time with his frantic heartbeat. They were not scars. They were the cracks. Visible, tangible proof of his failure. He was not Izuku Midoriya, the hopeful hero. He was not Deku, the one who saves. He was a prisoner in his own body, the jailer of an infinite power he had broken. He had woken from his coma, but the nightmare was not over. He had just woken up inside of it, and this time, he was afraid he would never be able to fall asleep again. The term, released, was a clinical, cruel euphemism. Izuku Midoriya was not released from the hospital. He was transferred. It was a procession devoid of celebration, carried out with the somber efficiency of a hazardous material disposal. His escort consisted of Aizawa and a grim-faced All Might, flanked by 4 of UA's top security personnel clad in bulky, quirk-dampening armor. The worst part was the cuffs. They were not the simple metal restraints of law enforcement. These were masterpieces of support technology, designed by Power Loader and Mei Hatsum in a frantic, 48-hour rush. They were thick, obsidian black bracers, clasped around his wrists and ankles, humming with a low, dissonant energy. Intricate silver circuits snaked across their surface, glowing with a faint, pulsing blue light. Aizawa explained their function in a flat, detached voice. They're not quirk suppressants. Your condition is too powerful for simple suppression. Think of them as regulators. They generate a counter-frequency field designed to reinforce the metaphysical container of your quirk. They're trying to help you hold yourself together. Izuku didn't need the explanation. He could feel them. The moment the first cuff was snapped shut around his wrist, it felt like a band of ice and pressure clamping down not just on his arm, but on his very soul. The raging ocean of One for All, which had been sloshing violently against the fractured walls of his being, was suddenly met with an external force, pushing back. The result was not relief. It was a sickening, nauseating increase in internal pressure. If his body was a cracked dam, the cuffs were an attempt to shore up the exterior. But the water level inside was still rising, the pressure building to an even more unbearable degree. A constant, low-grade nausea settled in his stomach. A dull, pounding headache took root behind his eyes. It felt like holding his breath for an eternity. His departure was a lonely one. He was wheeled through a sterile service corridor, his path cleared and secured. He caught a glimpse through a small window of Uraraka, Ida, and Todoroki standing in a distant hallway, watching him go. Their faces were a portrait of helpless concern. Uraraka raised a hand as if to wave, then let it drop. He wanted to call out, to tell them he was okay, but the lie caught in his throat. Besides, he was terrified that the emotion of seeing them, of wanting to reassure them, might cause a surge the cuffs couldn't handle. So he just looked away, his silence a chasm between them. His new home was Training Ground Gamma. From the outside, it was a monolithic, windowless cube of reinforced concrete and steel, a brutalist scar on the otherwise vibrant UA campus. It was designed to contain city block leveling explosions and reality warping quirks. It was a cage. Inside, it was just as bleak. His quarters consisted of a single, sparsely furnished room adjoining a vast, empty training hall. The bed was bolted to the floor. There was no metal cutlery, only polished, hardened bamboo. There were no electronics, save for a single, heavily shielded intercom panel. The lights were recessed behind thick, impact-proof casings. Every object, every surface, had been chosen to minimize the potential for conductive or kinetic chain reactions. It was a prison designed by a committee of physicists and paranoiacs. Food will be delivered 3 times a day, Aizawa said, his voice echoing in the sterile room. He stood in the doorway, unwilling to step fully inside. All Might and I will be in the observation booth. We're watching. We're listening. Try to rest. The heavy steel door slid shut with a deafening thud and the solid thunk of magnetic locks engaging. Izuku was alone. He stood in the center of the room for a long time, the hum of the cuffs a constant, maddening drone in his hyper-aware senses. He could feel the power inside him, pushing, always pushing. It was a living thing now, a blind, primal force that wanted out. The cuffs were a leash on a star, and he was the poor soul forced to hold it. The first few days were a lesson in a new and terrifying kind of helplessness. The leaking was constant, unpredictable, and intimately tied to his state of being. The first evening, as he sat listlessly on the edge of his bed, a wave of profound despair washed over him. He thought of All Might's disappointed face, of his mother who must be sick with worry, of the life he was supposed to have. A single, hot tear traced a path down his cheek. The moment the tear fell, the overhead lights in his room buzzed angrily. They flickered, their intensity spiking to a blinding white for a split second before one of them popped with a sharp crack, showering the floor with a fine powder of glass and filament. Izuku froze, his breath catching in his throat. His sorrow, a simple, human emotion, had a physical, destructive consequence, he learned quickly. Frustration made the air temperature fluctuate wildly. A spike of fear caused the magnetic locks on his door to whine at a piercing frequency. A moment of hope, a fleeting memory of a happy day with his friends, caused the cuffs on his wrists to feel momentarily warmer, the pressure lessening for a blessed instant before clamping down again. His emotional state was now directly wired to the physics of his environment. Even simple physical actions were a minefield. On the third day, lost in the fog of his own thoughts, his foot caught on the leg of the bolted-down table. He stumbled, his left hand shooting out instinctively to catch his fall against the concrete floor. It was a simple, reflexive movement. But his reflexes were now tied to a broken universe. A minuscule, undirected shard of One for All's potential, not even enough to be called a flicker of lightning, bled through the cracks. It wasn't a smash. It was a conceptual shove. The point where his palm met the floor didn't crack or shatter. The reinforced concrete simply gave way. It lost all structural integrity, crumbling into a fine gray powder. When he pulled his hand back, there was a perfect, palm-shaped indentation of dust in the solid floor, as if he had pressed his hand into a pile of ash. He stared at it, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hadn't even felt it. No recoil. No pain. Just a quiet, terrifying application of force that had turned stone to dust. What would that do to a person? To Uraraka's arm? To Ida's face? The nausea intensified. He scrambled back to his bed, pulling his knees to his chest, wrapping his arms around them as if he could physically hold himself together. He was a walking disaster, a porcelain doll filled with nitroglycerin, covered in hairline fractures. The cuffs were his constant tormentors. They kept the majority of the power contained, but the cost was immense. The sickness was a constant companion, a deep-seated wrongness that felt like his cells were being perpetually pulled in two different directions. Sleep offered little respite. He would often wake up gasping, the pressure in his chest so intense he felt like he was drowning, the cuffs glowing a furious, angry blue as they fought against a nocturnal surge of power. They left his skin raw and chafed, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the deeper, metaphysical agony. His isolation was absolute, a quarantine of the soul. Deep in the bowels of the earth, in the most secure penitentiary ever constructed, a monster stirred in the darkness. Tartarus was a tomb. A concrete and steel coffin buried miles beneath the ocean, designed to contain the uncontainable. For All for One, it was more than a prison, it was a sensory deprivation chamber. His life support systems kept his broken body functioning, but his true senses, the ones that perceive the vibrant, chaotic tapestry of quirks flowing through the world, were starved. Here, surrounded by suppressive fields and the null-energy signatures of quirkless guards, he was deaf, blind, and alone in a silent universe of his own making. He spent his days in meditative stillness, sifting through the centuries of memories stored within his mind, playing out old battles, savoring the taste of stolen powers. It was a tedious existence, a long, slow wait for an opportunity he knew would one day come. And then, days ago, it had happened. It was not a tremor. It was not a sound. It was a note. A single, perfect, impossible chord struck on the instrument of reality itself. It bypassed all of Tartarus's defenses, not because it was an attack, but because it was a fundamental shift in the very nature of the music. For a split second, the gray, silent world he inhabited was filled with a blinding, emerald-white light. He didn't see it with his eyes. He perceived it with the core of his being, with the original quirk that allowed him to steal others. He felt a presence that dwarfed everything he had ever known. It was the feeling of standing at the foot of a mountain and suddenly realizing the mountain was a god, and it was waking up. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, what it was. It was his brother's absurd, sentimental quirk. One for all. But it had done something he had only ever theorized about in his most ambitious dreams. It had achieved critical mass. It had reached the singularity. His first reaction, for the first time in over a century, was fear. A primal, instinctual terror in the face of a power that was truly absolute. It was a power that hadn't defeated its target with force, but had unwritten it from existence. His second reaction, which quickly subsumed the first, was an ecstatic, all-consuming desire. His life's ambition had been to steal one for all, to reclaim the quirk his foolish brother had spawned and perfect his own power. It had been a matter of principle, of completion. Now, that goal felt laughably quaint, pathetically small-minded. Stealing the quirk was no longer the prize. The quirk had evolved. It had breached its own limits. The prize was now the boy. The ninth user. The vessel who had somehow, impossibly, survived cracking open the door to infinity. He didn't just want the power anymore. He wanted the phenomenon. He wanted to possess the living gateway. To study him. To dissect him. To understand the mechanics of how a fragile human body could become a conduit for a reality-breaking event. And then, once he understood it, to take it for himself. Not just to steal a quirk, but to absorb the very concept of the singularity. It was the key to true godhood, a power beyond the simple collection of abilities. He had been waiting, patiently. He felt the initial cataclysmic event, and then he felt the power signature stabilize, but not disappear. It was contained, yes, but it was leaking. Faint, tantalizing whispers of that ultimate power were trickling out into the world, a constant beacon in the silent darkness of his prison. A trail of breadcrumbs for anyone with the right senses to follow. It was time. His body remained motionless in its metal womb, but his mind, his will, reached out. It was a contingency he had put in place long ago, a failsafe hidden in plain sight. It was not a telepathic quirk. It was far more subtle. A series of subvocal commands embedded within the memory of a long-dead subordinate, keyed to a specific chronometric and atmospheric trigger. The trigger had been the unique energy spike of the shattering. The command was simple. Awaken. Miles away, in a quiet, unassuming town, a man who called himself Junji Saito was watering his prize-winning petunias. He was a retired accountant, a quiet widower, a friendly neighbor. He was also a fanatical loyalist from a bygone era, a man who had willingly had his memories and personality overwritten by his master, all for one, decades ago, becoming a sleeper agent of unparalleled patience. His current personality was a fiction, a shell grown around the core command. The trigger washed over him. The watering can slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the stone patio. The pleasant, vacant look in his eyes sharpened into a chilling, predatory focus. The memories of Junji Saito, the gardener, evaporated like mist in the sun. What remained was the original consciousness, the hunter. His quirk was a unique and terrible one, the reason he had been chosen for this specific task. It was called Energy Siphon. He could not only track unique energy signatures, but he could also feed on them, drawing power from other quirk users to bolster his own strength. His master had always called him his finest hound. He turned his head, looking in the direction of Muzurifu. He could feel it now. A faint, exquisite taste on the air. A trace element of something divine. It was weak, shielded, but it was undeniably there. It was the scent of his new prey. Find the source, the ingrained command echoed in his mind. Test it. Weaken it. Push it until it breaks open again. And when it does, be ready to feast. A slow, cold smile spread across the face that had once belonged to Junji Saito. The hunt had begun. Midoriya-kun? The voice, soft and hesitant, crackled through the intercom. Izuku, who had been staring at the palm-shaped dust patch on the floor for the better part of an hour, flinched. Can you hear me? It's Uraraka. His heart seized. Uraraka. He hadn't seen her, not properly, since the battle. He'd been locked away, a contaminated specimen, while his friends were healing, worrying. He dragged himself over to the wall, his cuffed ankles scuffing on the concrete. He pressed the talk button. Uraraka-san, he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. You shouldn't be here. Aizawa-sensei gave me permission. Just for 5 minutes. Her voice was strained, but determined. I brought you some katsudan. From that place near the station. I know it's your favorite. Through the small, reinforced porthole in the door, he could see her. She stood there, holding a takeout container, her expression a painful mix of hope and worry. Her head was still bandaged, and she moved a little stiffly. He had done that to her. Indirectly, yes, but his failure was the cause. The guilt was a physical thing, a knot tightening in his chest. The pressure inside him spiked. I can't, he said, his voice barely a whisper. They have a special diet for me. You should go. Deku-kun, please, she pleaded, her voice trembling slightly. We're all so worried. We just want to know you're okay. Are you okay? No. The word screamed in his mind. I'm a monster. I'm a bomb. I hurt people by accident. I turn the floor to dust by tripping. I'm a prisoner in my own skin and I'm so scared. He wanted to tell her. He wanted to break down, to let her in, to let someone share this impossible burden. The desperate longing for connection, for a simple, human touch, welled up inside him. The energy within him swelled in response to the powerful emotion. The reinforced glass of the porthole he was looking through began to vibrate, emitting a low, resonant hum. Uraraka took a half-step back, her eyes widening as she heard the sound. Izuku saw her reaction, and the hope inside him shattered, replaced by ice-cold terror. He had almost done it again. He had almost lost control, right in front of her. His desire for comfort had almost become an attack. He snatched his hand back from the intercom panel and stumbled away from the door. Go away! He choked out, his voice loud and harsh. Just leave me alone! I don't want you here! The words were poison on his tongue. He didn't mean them. He meant the exact opposite. But they were the only weapons he had to protect her from himself. Through the porthole, he saw her face fall. The hurt in her eyes was a physical blow, worse than any punch he had ever taken. She stood there for a moment, clutching the katsudan, looking utterly lost. Then, she slowly placed the container on the floor in front of the door, gave it one last, sad look, and turned and walked away. The moment she was gone, Izuku's legs gave out. He slid down the wall, his back scraping against the cold concrete, until he was huddled on the floor. Sobs racked his body, but he choked them down, terrified of what another emotional outburst might do. He cried silently, his shoulders shaking, the hot tears he refused to let fall making the pressure behind his eyes unbearable. He had pushed her away. He had hurt her again. He was a hero who couldn't be near people. A symbol of peace who had to be locked in a cage. The irony was so cruel it was almost funny. His dream, the one that had driven him his entire life, was now a sick joke. You can be a hero. All Might's words echoed in his memory, a hollow taunt. How could he save anyone when he couldn't even control his own body? How could he bring hope when his very presence brought destruction? The psychological weight of it all was a mountain pressing down on him, grinding his spirit into dust just as he had done to the floor. The cuffs on his wrists and ankles felt heavier than ever, not just restraints, but a symbol of his eternal failure. He was Izuku Midoriya, the ninth user of One for All. He was the boy who had inherited the sun, only to shatter it into a million dangerous pieces. And in the profound, echoing silence of his prison, surrounded by the evidence of his own uncontrollable power, he felt more alone than he had ever been in his life. The storm raged inside him, and for the first time, he had no hope that the morning would bring a clear sky. The days in training ground Gamma bled into one another, a monotonous gray smear of isolation and fear. Izuku's world had shrunk to the four concrete walls of his cell and the vast, empty expanse of the adjoining training hall. He existed in a state of carefully cultivated numbness, a self-imposed emotional lockdown. He ate the bland, nutrient-paced meals that were delivered through a slot in his door. He did the basic physical exercises All Might prescribed over the intercom, simple stretches and calisthenics, all performed with painstaking, glacial slowness to avoid any sudden movements. He tried to sleep, but rest was a shallow, fitful thing, haunted by the feeling of immense pressure building against his ribs. His only company was the constant, nauseating hum of the regulator cuffs, and the ghost of his own reflection in the polished steel of his door. He saw a boy with haunted eyes, the vibrant green dimmed by exhaustion and despair. The Lichtenberg scars on his skin were a permanent fixture, a faint, sickly green road map of his failure. He was a leaking vessel, and his spirit was draining out just as surely as his power was seeping into the world around him. The training sessions with All Might were the focal point of his otherwise empty days. They were also a source of deep, gnawing frustration. Tashinori would sit in the shielded observation booth, his voice a disembodied, tinny sound over the speakers, guiding Izuku through exercises that felt both pointless and impossible. "All right, young Midoriya," All Might's voice would crackle. "Let's try again. Focus on the feeling. The pressure. Don't fight it. Just acknowledge it." Izuku stood in the center of the vast hall, his eyes closed, his fists clenched at his sides. The regulator cuffs felt particularly tight this morning, the blue circuits pulsing with an agitated rhythm. He could feel the ocean of one for all churning inside him, a maelstrom of chaotic energy. Acknowledging it was like acknowledging the sun was hot. It was an overwhelming, all-consuming fact of his existence. "I'm focusing," Izuku said, his voice flat. "Good. Now I want you to find a single point of leakage," All Might instructed. "Don't try to stop it. Just try to identify it. Feel its texture. Its temperature." Izuku gritted his teeth. It was an absurd request. It was like asking a man in a hurricane to identify a single drop of rain. The power was leaking from everywhere at once, a constant, low-level bleed of pure potential. He focused, trying to narrow the scope of his senses, to pinpoint one of the 1,000 tiny fissures in the dam. He found one. A small, almost imperceptible trickle of energy seeping from his left shoulder. It felt cool and sharp, like a needle of ice just beneath his skin. "I found one," he reported, his voice tight with concentration. "Excellent! Now, without tensing up, I want you to try and seal it. Mentally. Will it closed. Imagine your own spirit, your will, as a patch over the hole." Izuku tried. He visualized his will as a solid barrier, a shield. He pushed it mentally against the cool, sharp point of the leak. For a breathtaking second, he felt it work. The icy pinprick sensation vanished. The pressure inside him eased by a fraction of a percent. A wave of relief, so potent it was dizzying, washed over him. And that was his mistake. The relief, the flicker of hope, was an emotion. A powerful one. And his emotions were now fuel. The ocean inside him surged in response to the positive feeling. The pressure spiked violently. The single leak he had just sealed burst open again, 10 times wider than before. A visible shimmer distorted the air around his shoulder, and a nearby sensor array on the wall shorted out with a loud pop and a puff of black smoke. Izuku cried out, stumbling back as the internal pressure slammed into him, making his head spin. The cuff on his left wrist flashed a bright, angry red, its counter-frequency field struggling to compensate for the sudden surge. The nausea returned with a vengeance, and he doubled over, gasping, "Young Midoriya! Are you all right?" All Might's voice was laced with panic. Izuku couldn't answer. He was on his hands and knees, sweat beading on his forehead, his entire body trembling. The training wasn't working. It was making things worse. Every attempt to control the power, to contain it, only seemed to agitate it further. It was a vicious, hopeless cycle. His own will, his own emotions, the very things that had made him a hero, were now his greatest enemies. He stayed on the floor for a long time, long after All Might had ended the session. He felt utterly defeated. The path forward wasn't just difficult, it seemed to be a logical impossibility. How could he control a power that fed on his very attempts to control it? Exhausted, broken, and hollowed out, he did the only thing he could. He let go. He stopped fighting, stopped trying, stopped thinking. He simply lay on the cool concrete floor of the training hall, closed his eyes, and allowed the misery to wash over him. He let the despair consume him, hoping to find a quiet bottom to the endless abyss. And in that moment of complete surrender, something shifted. By giving up the conscious struggle, by letting his exhausted mind drift away from the physical world, he inadvertently loosened his anchor to reality. The roar of the internal storm, which had been a constant, deafening background noise, suddenly grew louder, more immediate. The feeling of the concrete floor beneath him faded. The hum of the cuffs receded. He was falling again, tumbling into the emerald vortex at the heart of One for All. But this time, it felt different. His surrender in the real world translated to a strange kind of buoyancy here. He wasn't being torn apart by the gale. He was drifting in its currents, a leafless twig in a cosmic river. He saw the tormented, flickering forms of the other vestiges, still struggling against the chaos, their existence a constant battle to maintain their own integrity. He drifted past them, deeper into the storm, drawn by an invisible current toward the relative calm at its center. He found himself once again on the small, stable island where Yoichi Shigaraki and Nana Shimura waited. They looked just as they had before, solid and real amidst the phantom chaos, their expressions a mixture of pity and intense focus. "He's here," Nana said, her thought voice a soft chime in his mind. "He surrendered," Yoichi observed, his gaze analytical. "He gave up fighting the storm from the outside." A wise, if unintentional, first step. Izuku's spectral form solidified, kneeling on the phantom ground before them. He didn't have the strength to stand. "I can't do it," he projected, the thought heavy with despair. "All Might's training, it's not working. Every time I try to plug a leak, I just make it worse. My own emotions, they're the trigger." "Of course they are," Yoichi said, his tone matter-of-fact, not unkind. "You are trying to use a bucket to stop a tsunami. Your conscious will is finite. The power you are trying to contain is, for all practical purposes, infinite. It is a battle you can never win through direct opposition." Nana drifted closer, her form radiating a warmth that felt like a distant memory of a comforting hug. "The shattering didn't just break the vessel, Izuku. It changed the rules. You can't think of this power the way Toshinori did. His task was to wield a sword. Your task is to become the calm eye of a hurricane." Izuku looked up, confused. "The eye of the hurricane? But I am the hurricane." "No," Yoichi corrected, his voice sharp and precise. "You are the focal point. The power moves through you. You have been trying to build walls against it. You must learn to become a channel for it instead." The philosophy of One for All is no longer about output. It is about flow. Izuku's mind reeled. A channel? How could he be a channel without letting the infinite power flood out and destroy everything? As if sensing his confusion, another figure flickered into existence beside Nana. It was a man with a wild mane of dark hair and a fierce expression, his form a chaotic nest of lashing black energy. Daigoro Banjo, the fifth user. He was less stable than Nana or Yoichi, but his will was a palpable force, holding his shape together. "He's right, kid." Banjo's thought voice was a low growl. "You've been using my quirk all wrong. We all have," he gestured, and a phantom strand of black whip extended from his arm. "On the outside, you use this to grab things. To move. It's a tool. But its true nature is to channel and direct energy. That's what it was for me. A way to extend my will." The spectral form of Banjo began to shift. The black whip tendrils that comprised his body turned inward, weaving themselves into a complex, intricate web, like a vascular system or a neural network, all contained within the outline of his human shape. "The shattering has given our quirks a new purpose," Banjo explained, his voice clearer now that his form was more stable. "They are not just extra tools for you to use anymore. They are your new control system. They are the regulators you must build on the inside." He focused his attention on Izuku. "Black whip. Don't push it out. Pull it in. Use it to create a web inside yourself. A network of conduits. When a leak springs, don't try to plug it with your will. Instead, weave a new path for the energy. Guide the flow away from the fracture and redirect it back into the main current of the storm. Don't stop the river, just change its course." The concept was staggering. To use Black Whip internally? Not as a weapon, but as a form of biological, energetic plumbing? Before Izuku could fully process this, another figure solidified. Haikid Shinomori, the fourth user, his form pale and translucent. He had been a hermit, a man who had held One for All for decades without ever truly using it, his life dedicated solely to containment. His presence was quiet, subtle, but possessed a profound, ancient awareness. "My quirk," Shinomori's thought voice was a faint, dry whisper, like rustling leaves. Danger sense. For you, it has been a torment. A constant alarm bell with no off switch. That is because it is warning you of the greatest danger, yourself. His pale eyes seemed to look right through Izuku. You have been treating it as an external warning. Listen to it differently. It is not just screaming danger, it is telling you where the danger is coming from. It is a diagnostic tool. It is your early warning system for a pressure buildup. When the scream in your head intensifies in a specific direction, that is where a surge is about to happen. That is where a new fracture in the vessel is about to form. It gives you a precious few milliseconds to react. A third figure joined them, his form a swirling, unstable cloud of gray smoke. And the sixth user. His voice was a muffled, ethereal echo. And when you cannot redirect it, you must vent it. And project it. My smokescreen. You see it as a tool for concealment. But its true nature is the harmless release of excess energy. It is a pressure valve, a tiny, controlled leak that you can direct. The cloud that was then swirled, and a small, precise puff of smoke vented from his spectral hand. A normal surge is a chaotic, destructive explosion, but if danger sense warns you of a coming spike, and Black Whip cannot redirect it in time, you can use smokescreen to open a tiny, temporary channel. You can vent a small, precise amount of the excess pressure into the atmosphere. It will manifest as harmless smoke and dissipated light. It is inefficient. It is wasteful, but it is infinitely better than an uncontrolled detonation. Izuku stared at the three vestiges, his mind struggling to assemble the pieces of this new, terrifyingly complex puzzle. Black Whip was his internal circulatory system for the power. Danger Sense was his diagnostic and early warning system. Smokescreen was his emergency pressure release valve. These weren't just 6 extra quirks he carried. They were a symbiotic control suite, a biological and metaphysical life support system that had been dormant until the shattering had made them necessary for his very survival. This is your new training, ninth, Yoichi said, his voice bringing Izuku's focus back to him. Forget 100%. Forget smashes. Those concepts are poison to you now. Your path to mastery is no longer about strength. It is about balance. It is about flow. It is about learning to listen to us, to the very tools that make up the whole of One for All. Nana Shimura placed a spectral hand on Izuku's shoulder. It had no substance, but he felt a wave of profound, stabilizing warmth. We are part of this power, Izuku. We are part of you now, more than any user before. You don't have to do this alone. We are the whispers in the storm. You just have to learn how to listen. The world of the vestige realm began to fade, the storm receding not into chaos, but into a low, background thrum. The island of calm dissolved, and the faces of his predecessors vanished. Izuku's eyes snapped open. He was back on the cold floor of the training hall. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the empty space. He had been gone for hours, but something was different. The crushing, nauseating pressure was still there. The hum of the cuffs was still a maddening drone. But his perception of it had changed. He could feel the ocean inside him, but now he could also feel the currents. He could sense the intricate web of fractures in the vessel of his being, and for the first time, he could hear the whispers. He pushed himself to his feet, his body still weak, but his mind sharp and clear. He closed his eyes, turning his focus inward, not with the brute force of his will, but with a gentle, listening attention. He let danger sense scream. But instead of recoiling from the noise, he listened to its texture. It wasn't a uniform screech. It was a complex harmony of alarms. There was a high-pitched whine corresponding to a pressure point near his right knee. A low, throbbing hum from behind his left eye. He could feel dozens of them, a symphony of potential disasters. He chose the smallest one, a faint point of pressure building in his left hand, the one that had crumbled the concrete. He didn't try to force it shut. He remembered Banjo's words. Don't stop the river, just change its course. He reached for Black Whip. But he didn't push it out of his skin. He willed it to manifest inside his arm. He felt a strange, cold tingling as phantom tendrils of dark energy wove themselves through his tissues, not damaging them, but existing in a symbiotic, metaphysical space alongside them. He felt the tendril touch the pressure point. Then, with a gentle mental nudge, he guided the tendril, creating a new path, weaving it back up his arm and into the central, raging storm in his chest. The pressure point in his hand vanished. He hadn't stopped the leak. He had rerouted it. A breathless, shaky laugh escaped his lips. It was a tiny victory, on a microscopic scale. But it was a victory. It was a single step on a path that, an hour ago, he hadn't even known existed. He opened his eyes, looking at his trembling hands. The regulator cuffs were still humming, but the light seemed a fraction less intense, the pressure a tiny bit more bearable. This was not a cure. This was management. Constant, exhausting, moment-to-moment management of a power that wanted to tear him and the world apart. But it was a path. He stood taller, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a sliver of something he hadn't felt in weeks: purpose. He was still a leaking vessel, a broken container, but he finally had the tools, not to fix the cracks, but to manage the flood. His mission was no longer to be the strongest. It was to be the most controlled. He looked up at the shielded glass of the observation booth, where he knew All Might was watching, probably worried sick. He couldn't explain this to him. Not yet. This was a lesson that had come from within the storm itself. He took a deep, steadying breath. The whispers were still there. Frightening, but no longer meaningless. For the first time since the shattering, he felt like he wasn't just a prisoner of One for All. He was its partner, its warden, and its student. The training was just beginning.